হ্যাঁ বলো।
Okay,
Sumanda is here.
it's okay.
Sumanda
হ্যাঁ,
have joined.
ওয়েলকাম টু সুমন। সুমন, Professor Suman Mukherjee is the head of the Department of History. He is here with us. He is also the coordinator of NAC, which is National Accreditation Council, and of IQSC especially. He is the coordinator of IQSC. We are happy to have Suman here. It is an honor for us to have Suman. Suman said that he has some problem with his smartphone, so maybe he will not be able to talk. So anyway, we warmly will welcome Shumon sir, and we all welcome also Shushanto sir, and a very very warm welcome to Professor Fitzsimmons from Australia. And I am just going to introduce briefly Professor Phil, and then we can move on to his lecture directly. Now, Professor, and I also welcome all the participants who have joined us today here, both on Facebook and on Google Meet. A very very warm welcome to all of you. It's so nice to have you here with us during all these endeavors that we are taking place during this COVID situation. This technology is helping us to reach out to each other and share our thoughts on various topics, and very very fortunate to have Professor Phil with us. Now, Professor Phil Fitzsimmons is Associate Professor at Avondale University College, Australia. Professor Fitzsimmons is currently an independent researcher and educational consultant. Prior to this, he was Assistant Dean of Research in Faculty of Education, Business and Science at Avondale University College, Australia, where he is currently a doctoral supervisor and board member of the Spirituality Research Center. Prior to this, he was Director of Research at San Roque Research Institute, California. So this is a very brief intro of Professor Phil. So happy to have you here, sir. The topic that Professor Phil will be talking on today is Bram Stoker's Dracula, the vampire as polyvalent focus of narrative stain. So we can move over to the lecture directly now, and I hand it over to Professor Phil for his lecture. Sir, you can start off now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Debayan. Hi, everybody. I have to admit this is very disconcerting for me, and it's disconcerting in lots of ways. Firstly, I have worked with several Indian academics in the area of English, and I suspect, knowing what they know, that the people who are listening to this or watching this have probably forgotten more than I will ever know. Indian academics and people interested in English and English literature are highly conversant on the subject. And so I hope that I am not telling you what you already know. And I suspect I am. I don't really know you and you don't know me. So thank you for this opportunity. I also find it disconcerting, and this is the first lecture like this that I've actually done in about 10 years. Because in my world, we teach constructively, and I'm sure that you do too. I mean, I just finished a lecture series last week on spirituality for postgrad students. And each lecture went for about half an hour more than it should have, because we talked and we interacted. So you're going to have to bear with me, because I'm not used to just sitting and talking. But we'll have questions at the end. I also need to tell you, since we don't know each other, I need to set the scene of where I'm coming from. I'm actually coming from an educational point of view, perspective. Can we flip the next slide, Debian, or can I do it? That's okay.
Ashutosh will do it. Ashutosh will. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And so, while I work in the area of critical literacy or text analyst, I actually come from an educational background. And I have been concerned for a long, long, long time with why and how do we read? Why do we do it? How do we do it? What goes on? But simultaneously, I've been working with a colleague and by myself, interviewing writers, professional writers including Mem Fox, Australia's leading children's author, in trying to answer the question, why do writers write and how do they write? Answering those questions through the ethnographic eyes of a researcher. In other words, I go into cultures and I talk to people, interview people and sit with them. I've been trying to answer these questions, and this is where today's talk comes from. There's an old saying in the text analyst world is that we read to know that we are not alone. In other words, we try to see when we read, what other people are thinking, doing, questioning, what's going on. That metaphysics of being, that existential understanding of who am I, where do I come from, where do I fit. That's why I suspect that we read. The problem with that is that there's been a long debate, which is kind of dying out, a long debate between high culture and low culture, high literature and low literature. And so in some parts of the world, they are dying out. The only literature that is taught are the supposed classics, Shakespeare, for example. But in fact, when you start talking to young people and looking into the world of popular culture, there are good comics and bad comics. There are engaging graphic novels and poorly written graphic novels. There are great movies and poor movies. So I don't really work in that high-low culture spectrum. I rely on the people I talk with and work with, young people mainly. What do they consider to be engaging texts and why? And what I'm finding is, and they teach me, what I'm finding there are graphic novels, for example, who touch on the same existential questions that Shakespeare touched on. Shakespeare was concerned deeply with his own understanding of the world and his own perception of inferiority and his own lack of sense of being. And so every one of Shakespeare's dramas, maybe the comedies, maybe not, are certainly dealing with personality disorders that I believe Shakespeare saw in himself. And so we read to sense that we are not alone in this world, that there are other people asking the same existential metaphysical questions and the same sense of transcendence, and all of which I'll come back to in a minute. So why do writers write? How do they go about that? How do they deal with these existential questions? Well, the most important thing to realise is that professional writers, and certainly the writers of fame and the writers of the classics, were no different to you and I. The only difference is that they persevered. That's all that it is. In persevering and writing, several key things come into play. And can we turn to the next slide, please, Atush? Okay. So in my educational world, in my world of literacy, learning, language development, and literature, I believe that there are three, which I call the social model of literacy. There are three core elements, and this is what I'm basing my chat with you today. And certainly this comes out of how good writers write. Sorry, we're all good writers. We don't all persevere. Those who persevere, and those who are published, and those who are famous writers, and the writers of classics, all delved into three core elements: habitus, context of situation, and context of culture. And that's what I'm basing today's chat about. Stoker certainly touched and delved into these. This really came to light in 2018, 2019, when I did a major project looking at Ray Bradbury, one of the top science fiction writers, who also wrote about vampires. His vampires were in the category of what we now call soft horror. Maybe I'll come to that, maybe I won't get a chance. But certainly in looking at how interviewing other writers And certainly in interviewing, looking at Ray Bradbury's interviews and listening and reading to his interviews and reading into what he wrote and what other authors wrote. Ray Bradbury's science fiction and vampire horror was very much involved in his habitus, context of situation and context of culture. Habitus is that Bourdieuian notion of those predispositions we get from our family. What M.A.K. Halliday calls that little coterie of learning language. And we all have that. We all have these habitus predispositions to language use. We all grow in families that tell stories. I believe we are narrative beings. We talk in narrative, we think in narrative. I've never met anyone in my work who dreams in taxation reports. We all dream in narrative. And we have, as I said, this predisposition to the language of the family narrative, the narratives that are told in the family. And highly literate children, such as Ray Bradbury, for example, and children who were immersed in narrative, such as Bram Stoker, have this constant thread of narrative going on in their head. And so this runs through the rest of our lives. It can be changed, it's not set in concrete. But typically, we touch on our habitus when we write. The context of situation is the context, and I'm stating the blooming obvious. The context of situation is that situation in which the child grows up, the family situation, and the extended family, and the neighbourhoods. That also affects the child's writing ability, speaking ability. And of course, the context of culture. Every child and every family and every context of situation is immersed in a context of culture which influences particularly a writer. Now, all classic writers, and I'll use that term very broadly as I think I've explained, all classic writers actually start very young. Graham Greene, for example. I love Graham Greene's work. Graham Greene said his writing was the product of everything that he had read before he was 15. Ray Bradbury made it very clear time and time again and gave clear examples that his writing capability of narrative, science fantasy, science fiction and horror grew out of what he was thinking and seeing before he was 6 years of age, and certainly before he was 12. Ray Bradbury grew up in a very poor family who managed to go to the movies, and so in an intertextual sense, he was like a sponge, like many of the published authors are, great published authors are. They soak in numerous forms. They soak in the architecture of language and narrative. In other words, the way that it's structured, the way that it looks, the intertextuality. In other words, all writing comes from somewhere, it just doesn't pop out of their heads. And so they draw on other narrative forms, other language forms, but they transact with it. It's not plagiarism. They transact all the other language and narrative around them and make it their own. And there's transtextuality. Ray Bradbury's a classic example. He took movie narrative and put it into print narrative. So that's where I'm coming from. I may or may not give you specific examples of what Stoker wrote, but I can certainly show some of the influence and some of the influences around Stoker at a very early age, which allowed him later on to write Dracula. Now, I'm going to make some assumptions, which is very dangerous. I'm assuming that you either have read Dracula or have, at the very least, perhaps seen a movie of Dracula, or at least are aware of Dracula. In today's world, hardly a day goes by without some sort of vampiric reference or some sort of vampiric illustration appearing on television. I've worked extensively in the USA, and I know there is a cartoon channel almost solely devoted to children's cartoons around the vampire. Certainly in Australia, England and the United States, some cereal packets had the vampire image on it. So while kids are sitting eating their cereal for breakfast, they're becoming immersed in this vampiric image. They know what it is. Yes, it's being Disneyfied. It's been cartoonified. And so it may look the same, but may tell a different narrative. So that's where I am actually coming from. Atush, I hope I got your name right. Can you move on to the next slide, please? I may follow these slides, I may not. And so first, having said that, what is the narrative stain? That's what we're talking about. Well, the narrative stain arose out of the beginning work of Hallström in her work on film, and in particular, film that dealt with colonisation. And she realised that much of the film on colonisation dealt with trauma, the trauma of the coloniser, what they did to the people they took over. And having read that, I began to look at, as I said, the work of other authors and other film producers, and suddenly realised that this notion of the stain is there. Now, the stain is metaphysical. In many movies, for example, and certainly in Dracula, you can see and you can actually read about the spilt blood. That is highly representative of personal trauma, of social trauma, and of deep cultural memories which are carried through narrative. And the issue is that we all find it very difficult facing trauma, individually, socially, and culturally. I can give you an example. We now know that one of the pillars of Australian culture, and in many cases personal habitus, is the notion of the Australian Anzac, the soldier who fought in the First World War. We have developed this mythic notion that they were young, blonde, blue-eyed, brave, there for kingdom and country. And that is carried on to today. But we now know that is totally wrong. We now know they were totally different. And yet we have mythologized, this whole notion of king and country and colonisation to our social detriment. We have not faced up to who we are. Social researchers recognise that Australians do not know who they are in 2020. It's because we have not faced up to the narrative stain. So it's always there. A colleague and I have started looking at this in cinema, and as I said, more recently I've been looking at it in narrative, and I suspect it's there. Oh, by the way, don't believe a word I say. Even a stopped clock tells the truth twice a day. Don't believe a word I say. Especially when it comes to Stoker, to Bram Stoker. Bram Stoker, of all the authors I have ever dug into and delved into, left very little of what he was thinking, what he was doing. He did leave a great deal of notation about writing Dracula, but it's mainly in shorthand, Victorian time shorthand. It's very difficult to understand. He kept a diary in regard to writing Dracula and his thoughts. Is it any consequence? Is it any coincidence? Is it any constructive way related to that Dracula is actually written as a diary as well? But you also have to understand, and I'll come to this I hope later on, is that of all the books that Stoker wrote, Dracula was the longest he spent on. He incubated this book for 6 years and kept a diary and kept on going backwards and forwards, intertextually, between the diary and writing Dracula. His other books were pot boilers. They were written very, very quickly without any incubation and without that reflective work on writing about his writing. Kathy Shalmaz says is that good reflective writing is like rendering cement on a wall. It's writing by rendering. He only did that with Dracula. And by the way, I would argue, all the great classics, whether they're in modern popular culture or in ancient texts, were all incubated. Time was spent. And so, what he did, what I want to argue is that in Dracula, we see the narrative stain, the personal, the social and the cultural stain that was embedded in Stoker at a very early age coming to the fore. And as Barbara Belford said, he got rid of all his anger and angst in Dracula. Okay, I hope I'm saying Atush's name right. Can you move on to the next slide, please? Okay, I'll come back in a minute to Stoker and this notion of habitus and context of situation and culture. Deeply embedded in narrative, I distinguish them, lots of people don't. We use the word tropes to show how cultural knowledge is transferred metonymically or metaphorically from text to text to text to text. And that occurs naturally. We just can't help it. If, like many of the great writers, and as Graham Greene, as I said, if you become immersed in narrative, it's like, as Hayakawa says, standing under Niagara Falls. You are just washed over with language and narrative and the tropes that or metaphors that other authors have used. I think there is a deeper meaning within narrative, which I call archetypes. Leeming talks about how that in narrative, we always rely on the mythic imagination. In other words, those archetypal elements that were way back when text first came into being, were way back when oral narrative was the means by which cultures told stories. Cultures transmitted their cultures. Now, having lived in India and worked with several Indian academics and having several Indian friends, I know that your culture has arguably the deepest and richest and longest lived narrative on the globe. Your spiritual texts are as ancient as they go way, 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 way back, and they contain all the archetypes of being. Now, Joseph Campbell, for example, in his work on narrative around the globe, came to the realization that every culture has a similar set of archetypal elements to their narratives. They shift and change according to context of situation and context of culture, but they're remarkably the same. One of the key archetypes is, of course, what I'm talking about today, the monster. And by the way, there is a Dracula figure in every culture's narrative. We have more recently discovered that the Aboriginal nations, the first peoples of Australia, with a culture of 60,000 years, have an oral history and a visual narrative history, and we now know that even though they were separated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, a Dracula-like figure appears in their narratives. Is that a coincidence? I don't think so. I'll come to that later. Certainly in Latin, the most ancient narratives we have in writing, or some of them, use the word monstrare, which we translate as monster, but they understood it to mean, in Latin, to teach. So monsters in our narratives still carry that archetypal and tropic element, is that they are there to teach us. We have to read polyvalently through the many layers, through the many levels that narratives cover. The problem is is that monsters are all about failed repression. As cultures grow and develop, if they carry forward the narrative stain and don't deal with it, it becomes repressed, and that's when it becomes dangerous. What I'm arguing is that the whole notion of the monster and the whole notion of the narrative stain and the whole notion of narrative is for us to read to know that we are not only alone, but we have to learn. We have to grow and change. And so, in 1999, the father of monster studies wrote that we live in a time of monsters. If in 1999 we lived in a time of monsters, what is it like now? Where every turn of every page, every turn of every newspaper, every time we turn the TV on, we are faced with the monster. You can see I just plucked this image of Dracula out of the web. It carries with it archetypal elements. If you were to look at the poster that Debayan kindly put together with the image of the vampire at the back, it carries with it this archetypal notion of what the monster is. In fact, the embodiment of the monster is culture itself. We can read the monster through the visuals. Now, if I were with you on Zoom, for example, I would be asking you, what can you see? Certainly, as I'm looking at this image, what this image tells me from art history and from systemic functional linguistics in regard to visualization is that this image carries the trope and the archetype of the monster, of the vampire. You can see his left hand is forward. The left is symbolic of depression, depravity, and evil. That has been through our texts, our visual texts, since age immemorial. There are all sorts of other elements too, the notion of redness, of blood. Blood across all cultures typically typifies sacrifice, the shedding of blood within our deep religious spiritual self. But blood is also symbolic of the abject, according to Julia Kristeva. Those things that we need to deal with, those things that are the abject, and blood is typically the abject for a whole range of reasons which I'll probably come to. Hence, when I don't know if you go to see horror movies or not. I don't know what horror movies you have in India. I would love to know, maybe work with you in what sort of horror appears in Indian cinema. But certainly when you go to Australian cinema or Western cinema, you see people watching horror movies like this. One eye covered through a split. They want to see and yet they don't. That's the role of the abject. That's the role of the monster. To scare, but to draw you in. Hence the gaze of the monster on the screen at the moment is looking straight at you and trying to engage you. That's the role of the monster, to engage. But it's also the abject to push away. Okay, Ashtush, could you please go to the next? Okay. Hey, I'm actually following these slides. What a surprise. I don't normally do that. I normally wander around all over the place. Okay, so the narrative stains in Dracula. These are the critical points for Stoker. For the first 7 years of his life, Stoker was virtually an invalid. We don't know much about it, but what we do know from some of the diaries and from the snippets of print that we have, that he could not walk, that he was bedridden, and that it was his mother who carried him around. From the layout of the Stoker house, which is still standing, we know that his bedroom was below his parents' room. and that his mother would come and get him every day and take him to the windows where he could look out at the boats coming in. And now the sea is a classic trope in Dracula, which I hope I'll get to. But can you think of what would it be like for a young child to be virtually bedridden for 7 years? The first 6 years of life, and 7, are critical for a child's growth and development, their physical growth, their spiritual growth, and I'll come to that in a second. And the whole cognition develops in the first 7 years. We now know from cognitive science that for a child's brain to grow optimally, they have to move. Stoker couldn't. We don't know about his reading habits or his writing habits, but what we do know was that his mother, who was an academic, who actually wrote academic papers, was a member of an academic circle, was a political radical for her time, grew up in Sligo in northwest Ireland, and she grew up in I think it was the 1937 Sligo pandemic, the cholera pandemic, stunningly similar to what we are going through now, you and I. And we do know that she told him horror stories about the Sligo cholera pandemic. A child from 0 to 7 is a sponge. They soak up everything. We also know too, and we assume a great deal, that she told him a great deal of the horror stories in Irish folklore, which originated in that wild northwest of Ireland, around Sligo, around Donegal. They were horror stories, and some of which contained vampires. And so already we assume, and again I am assuming, as I said, don't believe a word I say, when we talk about Stoker we have to make lots of assumptions. We're assuming that started to seep into his brain. In fact, one of the things that he wrote very discursively, Stoker, in his diary, but one thing is very clear: he did say that much of the early stories that he heard became formulaic in regard to Dracula. He was not specific, but there's some other things we can connect with: the notion of the vampire, the notion of the horror of the cholera pandemic. Certainly in Sligo itself, it was the epicenter of the cholera pandemic. People died in the streets, and their bodies were just piled high on the street. We do know that when people died of cholera, sometimes they survived, but their heart rate and pulse rate was so low they were deemed to be dead. And while they were lying on the slab in Sligo, and the slabs were just anywhere they could pile the bodies, there were so many dead people, that they suddenly awoke, seemingly from the dead. And of course, having cholera, they were pale, they were gaunt and bloodless. So we can assume that it's more than likely that Stoker's mother told him, to keep him occupied, told him very vivid stories of what she had seen and experienced herself. And in fact, some of her close relatives died in front of her with cholera. And so certainly we can assume that had a deep influence on the writing of Dracula, especially since he spent 6 years writing it. The next thing too is the notion of the relationship with his mother. And while a lot of commentators have read into this lots of psychometric and Freudian psychology into this, which may or may not be there, certainly we can deal with several things from what we know. From what we know about cognition and child growth and development. The first significant other in a child's life is its mother. In utero, we now know that a child becomes deeply attached to its mother because in utero it hears its mother's voice. In the language and literacy world I inhabit, we now know that children are predisposed to the language that they will later employ by hearing it in utero from their mother. We also know that if a mother reads to a child in utero, it gets used to the cadence of its mother's voice. We know, for example, that children towards the end of gestation hear quite well. They react to an ambulance 5 blocks away. They also become attached, and that word is critical, they become attached to its mother's taste for food and become predisposed to it. The latest research in linguistics has shown that a child's use of language once it is born bears a stunning resemblance in the vowels that they use to the way that a mother articulates her vowels when she talks. So it's a deeply engaging process. Aitchison tells us and recommends to all researchers that when we're dealing with children in any way, we have to remember that in utero growth and development is based around 3 things. And they're in our DNA. We are spiritual beings, we are sexual beings, and we are social beings. They're the things we carry forward once we are born. They can be corrupted, but if a child becomes attached to a significant other and significantly attached after birth, they will grow in those 3 dimensions. The spiritual thing I wasn't too sure about until I recently read a paper by a Norwegian academic. And by the way, she was a quantitative researcher, I'm a social researcher. And in my world, with statistics, there are damn statistics and damn lies. But she was able to demonstrate that a child's use of language and attachment and engagement with the mother, and I quote from this paper, leads them, has a possibility of leading them to transcendence. So we are not so much human beings on a spiritual path, we are spiritual beings on a human path, and literacy plays a deep part of that. Stoker's attachment to his mother was deep. She was virtually the only significant other in his life for 7 years. His father was what we call the absent father. An absent father in the world of literature, for example, we know is a trope of contact with evil. That's how evil is developed in literature typically. Now, I'm not saying his father was evil, but I am saying he was definitely absent. And so Stoker had this attachment to his mother and significant attachment to his mother, but yet not with his father. And so we assume that Stoker grew up with a lot of inabilities. The inability to understand what manhood is. How does a man act? How does a man talk? But we do know that some of the interactions that he had with Mrs. Stoker, his mother, we know that his bedroom was just underneath theirs. Well, we assume that it was underneath theirs, very close. And in a Victorian household in the 1800s, he was born in 1847, by the way, there was not much hidden in a Victorian household. He was lucky to have a house. He was born in Ireland into a very poor society. His habitus, his social setting within the family at that time was, they weren't rich, but they certainly weren't wealthy. They were relatively poor. His father was a clerk. But we know, for example, that not much was hidden in a Victorian household that was made of wood. We assume that the Stokers were like many Victorian households. They went to bed early. They got up around midnight, where they ate, had a cup of tea, often had sex, often had an argument, and went back to bed. And everyone knew what was going on with the parents in the household. Death was a common facet of a Victorian household inside the house. And so what I'm arguing is that Stoker had the absent father syndrome. He was looking for affirmation from within, with every male that he met. I'll come to that in a little bit. Because we now know that he was a deeply troubled human who put up a mask. We know, for example, that around the age of 7, miraculously, he started to walk. Now, no one knows exactly what happened. But we do know that as he grew and developed, he grew into an ideal of what manhood was. But from other people. He went to Trinity College and became a rugby league player. The rough and tumble and brawling of the rugby field. We know that he was a great debater. We assume that came from his habitus of his mother. And so the arguments he developed over 6 years were cultivated from his mother, and he becoming a human being and having to stand on his own 2 feet and argue. But that was a mask. In many ways it was a mask, and I'll explain that in a minute. We also know too that he saw many rescues from his bedroom overlooking the water of Eastern Ireland. And at that time that was symbolic of, well, we're assuming, was very symbolic of the narratives his mother must have told him. The poor woman who needed rescue. The brave man who actually rescues. And in fact, Stoker actually rescued a young child from the Thames, dived into the Thames, fully clothed, with all his Victorian suit on, and saved someone. He became the rescuer without really knowing what that meant. Debayan, have I still got time? I'm looking at my clock. Okay, I'll keep on going.
Yes, sir, of course. Please go on.
Ashutosh, can you...
It's very fascinating, please go on. Yeah.
Can you go to the next slide, please, Ashutosh? Okay. So I'll talk very briefly about his habitus. He was what he was what he idealised a human being to be and what a male was supposed to be. In his context of situation, it was just as turbulent. He was born in 1847. And from 1847 onwards was a period of invasion. There were radicals in Ireland who were rabble-rousers because they wanted to be separated from England. And so there were constant Irish rebellions. And that was part of his family household and discussions as well. You see, his mother and father were Anglo-Irish. They were in the minority, but part of the ruling elite of Ireland, and they knew full well they were hated. They knew full well they were the others. And in amongst all this Irish rebellion, they were the pinnacle of the focus of disenfranchisement, of having the possibility of being booted out, of being killed. They were effectively the other. And so Stoker was caught in this liminal zone, this in betwixt and between. He was neither a child nor a man. He grew up and transferred across that boundary, which takes much time, and yet was forced to go across those boundaries, not really knowing what they were, or how to actually be it, or actually how to do it. He was between childhood and adulthood, and I suspect when you're looking deeper into his other books and make intertextual connections and look deeper into Dracula, you find that Dracula himself is the epitome of how Stoker was feeling. Betwixt and between, in that dark world of liminality. That's where monsters dwell, by the way. All monsters in all text, in all narrative, dwell in that in-between, the liminal, the grey zone, it's called. He was in a context of situation where his own family, his own world was betwixt and between. Irish and yet not Irish, and yet not English either. When he moved to England later in life, as Henry Irving's offsider, an accountant and supporter of Henry Irving's acting career, he was not fully accepted. Because he had learnt to debate and argue and project himself, he was able to slide into that society, but never fully accepted. And he felt it. All his life he felt it. I'll come back to Irving in a minute. This whole notion of attachment. Now, children who grow up optimally are said to be securely attached. If you are securely attached, you feel comfortable in your own skin. You feel comfortable in your own voice. You are resilient to the knocks and buffets of the world. You have a significant other in your life to whom you are also securely attached, and it's a to and fro giving of love. Stoker never found that. He thought he did, which I'll come back to in a minute, but he never actually felt it. So therefore, because he was not securely attached to anyone else, except his mother who died, he was never securely attached to the world. That's something similar, very similar, stunningly similar to Dracula. Dracula came from the east, Transylvania, moved to London, and was not really accepted in any of those worlds. He was that shady character, the epitome of evil, that abject father figure. I want to argue, as Barbara Belford said in her book, and by the way, Barbara Belford used very little resources to back up her assertions. She said that Stoker projected himself into every character, but particularly Dracula, particularly the male figures in Dracula. So he rendered by writing his own sense of inadequacy, his own sense of insecurity, his own personality disorder. And so he was born into a land of invasion. The other aspect of invasion was that England and Ireland in particular, well, Ireland was a land, especially the West, was a land of invasion. The Saxons, the Vikings, you name it, they all invaded that coast and ransacked it. England at the time that he was born, and also up into the early 1900s, was fearful of European invasion. It was a context of situation of fear and uncertainty. The other issue that faced this Anglo-Irish world was that the things were changing rapidly in Europe, especially in England, not the least of which was the collapse of the East India Organisation in India. The colonisers had taken over a big chunk of where I think some of you are right now, in Bengal, and had decimated the land financially, not culturally, because eventually the Indian government later on, and certainly the local people, Maharajas, took control back, as far as I understand. But it was a time of insecurity where so much money had been made for England, the mother country from the East India Company, that it died. It went. And so Dracula was written in this period of uncertainty, of invasion. Some of the elements of Dracula are certainly there. That whole notion of Dracula following Harker to London and invading the bodies of Renfield, the psychotic, of Lucy, and inserting his fangs into their neck, or Lucy's neck at least, and then Lucy went and did his evil work as well. this whole notion of invasion of the body. There was also a pandemic going on at that time as well in England. Because of the shift in, well, it's a big leap, but there was a shift in moral values. There was a shift in sexuality. It had probably been always there, but it now came to the surface. And from what we gathered, there was periods of pandemic of syphilis running through the English culture at all levels during the time of Stoker's transition into manhood, through the transition of the writing, 6 years of writing Dracula. And so we have this notion of virus invasion, similar to the Sligo invasion of the cholera epidemic and virus that he'd heard about from his mother. And so there was invasion of the body. That's all through Dracula. Okay, I'm still thinking about where I'm going to go with this, because we could jump all over the place here at the moment as well. The other context of situation was, as I said, this whole shift in morals and also the shift in technology. And wherever there's been a dramatic shift in technology, there has been this undercurrent in society of insecurity. We now are starting to think that the reason that we have the president we have in the United States is because his constituents who voted for him were left behind in the shift in technology. And their insecurity lends itself to bringing to someone who appears on the surface to be strong. I would argue fascist, but that's just my personal opinion. And so there was this uncertainty invading England all the time. And certainly, for example, we can see very clearly in Dracula, the use of the typewriter is mentioned very clearly in Dracula. The notion of psychiatry is mentioned and very clear in Dracula. So there was different sorts of sciences and technology growing, and insecurity. That's where Stoker grew up in. That was his context of situation, and that was the context of Dracula. There was also a change in sexuality. The notion of the modern woman is a term that is used in many social texts and newspapers of the time. Women were growing and developing. Mina in Dracula says she's a secretary, which is interesting because that was the first step into the workplace of women. Very significant. Menial by today's standards, or perhaps not, but certainly women were growing in stature and strength. And in arguing for voting rights, the whole gamut of society was changing. And so this notion of sexuality is a flavour that runs all the way through Dracula. The assertive woman, the sexual being, the being who is comfortable in herself. There is also the notion in the relationship between Lucy and her mother in Dracula, between the two different cultures, and also between Mina and Lucy. One is young and assertive. Lucy is a philanderer, a wanderer, uncertain. And so is her mother as well. So there is a connection here with the rejection of motherhood in lots of ways. While Stoker didn't reject his mother, he certainly recognised that she was a foray into change and the rejection of what women were perceived to be in their social standing. You see, Stoker's mother, Charlotte, was a radical. At one stage, she and her husband had joined a group who were battling to get rid of England from the political milieu of the time in Ireland, which put them at odds with the rest of the English. She later left that group and became a fervent advocate for the poor and a fervent advocate to totally disassociate with England. Is it any wonder that we see that shift in the notion of femininity in Dracula? There are other elements as well, not the least of which is that when Stoker went to Trinity College, he bumped into a developing writer and would-be academic, Oscar Wilde. Now, while we can't say they were firm friends, certainly they knew each other, and certainly they were friendly. But this caused some angst, we assume, for Stoker. Oscar Wilde was already the flamboyant party-goer who later became the epitome of the other in England when he became gay, and openly gay. Stoker's friendship blossomed even further when, because Oscar Wilde's first girlfriend was in fact Stoker's wife. She was first in love with Oscar Wilde, but Wilde realised he couldn't support her because of his lifestyle. And so they separated, and Stoker took over as her suitor. But once they were both married, and both wives had the same name, by the way, first name, they used to eat together and dine together, so we assume they were relatively close. But Stoker had an issue, how to be friendly with the flamboyant gay Oscar Wilde and still maintain his social standing in his world of the theatre in England, because he became very, very attached to Henry Irving, the great Victorian actor. He became securely attached to Irving. Irving became a father figure, even though Irving treated him very badly. Financially, he did okay, working for Irving in the theatre and the Lyceum Theatre and getting all that up and running. But personally, he was treated very badly. And yet he still maintained that attachment. We assume it goes back to those early days of needing a father figure in his life. In fact, he was treated so badly, many commentators have noticed that Dracula, and the way Dracula kills, destroys, accumulates, is stunningly similar to the way that Irving treated Stoker. Stunningly similar. Where do we go to from here? And so there are many monsters in Stoker's life. There is the monster of Irving. There is the monster of lurking in Stoker's background of who he should become. While he was very, very attached to his brothers, not so much his sisters, there was some sort of angst there and some wanting to be like them. His elder brother became Ireland's first brain surgeon, a highly skilled surgeon. Another brother had military attachments, and by the way, his other brother, we now know, had maps of Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains. Did he serve there? We think so, but we're not certain, but certainly had maps of the area. And talking with his brother and using those maps is where he drew on for the site of Dracula. The Carpathians themselves were the epitome of that in-between India, the known and the source of money, the in-between England, the motherland. The Carpathians and the Carpathian Mountains were this unknown grey, dark area of wild people. Deeply, deeply paganistic, deeply superstitious. And so Dracula is right in the middle between the East and the West. And then Dracula actually, then moved to the West follows Harker across to England and then back to Transylvania. One of the archetypes of movement certainly in Western literature is the notion of the West as being the epitome and the source of knowledge. It's where you move to. If you look at all Western literature, I don't know what it's like in Indian literature. If you look at Western literature, there is this constant movement to the West. It follows the setting sun, rising in the east, setting in the west. The glow of the sunset. In Dracula moves from the east to the west and then back again. That is a sign and symbol and metonym of return to evil, return to darkness, return to the unknown. Okay, and so we can see some of the stains that were part of Stoker's early childhood, and partly the scuffs and stains and the rough and tumble of his growing up. Very, very, very briefly. There was trauma involved in this. There was a sense of colonisation and the death, excuse me, I'm getting thirsty, death of colony. There was the perceived smell of the enemy, of the unknown. That's where the monster lives. Wherever there is uncertainty in a culture, a monster appears in narrative. And Dracula is the epitome of the monstrous and appears at a time of uncertainty and change and liminality in a culture. Okay, so it's what Botting calls the black spot. Botting talks about when monsters like Dracula appear. It's a black spot representing a black hole in space. That thing that will draw you in, suck you in and kill you. But it's a mirror doubling. The monster is us, and we have to recognise that. We have to recognise that all the characteristics of Dracula are in us. They were in Stoker, they are in us. They are transcultural. They are crossroad markers to shifts and change. They are markers of where we should not go, but they are markers of where we have to go. And that is Dracula as a threshold figure in its essence of being. Okay, so I'm just going to go very quickly now. I'm still in context of... Can you go to press the next slide, please? Context of culture, we've been there. Okay, so certainly some of the big emblem, which I'm going to come back to now, is this notion of the father figure. There are father figures all through Dracula, as I've said. It is Dracula's alter self, alter ego, his other. Abraham Van Helsing, interesting. Van Helsing is given the same first name as Stoker himself. He saw himself in Van Helsing as that spiritual healer, the psychic detective, a person of wisdom, a barrister. Stoker was also a trained solicitor, if not barrister. He was accepted to the bar. We don't think he ever really practiced. And so Van Helsing as the saviour, which I've mentioned earlier on, is who Stoker wanted to be, but he wrote his way into meeting.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Excuse me. Siri activated herself when I mentioned a couple of words. Jonathan Harker, the passionless, the scholar, the one who kills Dracula in the end, in the east, in the darkness, in the epitome of the castle, that soulless place, that soulless trope where all evil occurs in Gothic literature. Harker slits Dracula's throat, just as Stoker wishes he could do to the self that he was not, to the self that he had become. I should say his true self. There is Mina, loyal Mina. very reminiscent of Stoker's mother. Smart, intelligent, a writer, old family, just as Charlotte Stoker was. Then we have Lucy, frivolous, sexualised. That was his fiancée, his wife-to-be, Florence. So there's a great deal made of Lucy's sexuality, which is another element of Stoker's persona and experience and context of situation. After the birth of their first son, Florence and Stoker's relationship became purely platonic. Some commentators actually call her frigid. And it is rumoured, and it is only rumour, that Stoker found himself often in the arms of prostitutes, and in fact the deep rumour of the English newspapers at the time was that he died of syphilis himself. The very emblem of what was occurring in his contexts, all his context, was perhaps the thing that killed him as well. Okay. How are we going with time? I think I'm almost done. Is that about right? Debayan?
Yeah, yes, sir. If you are towards the closing, then yes.
Okay, well, how about we go... I'm just going to argue that Stoker, very briefly, I'll go to questions. Was Stoker created Dracula as the absolute other because he had been othered all his life, or so he believed. And his only way of getting out and merging into their world of science and supernatural, and by the way, the context of culture of the time, was that in the slide into uncertainty, the British Victorians became deeply imbued with the notion of spirituality, but in the sense of spiritualism. And so the Gothic reared its head. They were also practicing seances and all sorts of things. But they crossed lots of boundaries, as did Stoker, as did Dracula. Okay, I'm running on empty. I'll stop there and I'll just throw it open to questions, if that's possible.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir, for the fascinating lecture. Actually, it's very interesting and very arresting. You have delved so deep into the myth and the legend of Dracula. There are some questions that Ashutosh will read out, and I had one thing in mind, means would you think that there is any connection with this monstrous nature in Dracula, and anything about satanic rites or something, and anything about the parallelism between immortality and the undead? If you can enlighten.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope I answer your question properly. So the whole notion of death was deeply imbued within, and correct me, Debayan, if I'm not answering your question, this whole notion of death is a constant part of Dracula, of the uncertainty, the unknown, the unknowing. We are all afraid, not so much of dying, but of the way that we're going to die. And so certainly Dracula does not die. He just transforms at the slitting of his throat and the other exorcistic rites that were performed into dust. And the whole notion of the monster is that it will return. And we hope against hope in our lives. And certainly in your world, you have a very different view to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant world, WASP world, to which I belong. You have a sense of, and I'm generalising and I apologise, the Hindu notion of reoccurring life towards some sort of final redemption. The Western world doesn't have that. The Western world is terribly afraid of death, to the point where we now do not, as in Stoker's day, the death rites were performed in the house, the washing of the body, the funeral rites. In the Western world, we don't have that. We are so afraid of it, we give it over to other people to do. Debayan, did I answer your question or not?
Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So Dracula actually, as a monster, it's called coincidentia oppostorum. The things that go on in Dracula actually have a bipolar opposite as well. Their aim is to teach, look, this is an epitome of evil, but at the same time, there was a sense to Dracula that life when we die does not end, it actually goes on. And that is all the way through Dracula. We can read Dracula in multi ways, in different forms. It's polyvalent, different voices. Debayan, I hope I answered your question. I think it was a very bad answer.
No, sir. It's okay. It's fine. You have cleared it. One other thing about this, do you find any connection with satanic things of that? The satanic rites or something like that? In the way that Dracula is undead and in that thing, do you find any connection with the legend or the symbol of Satan, or is it not actually relevant to Dracula?
Sorry, we're breaking up a bit. Say the legend
of Satan, legend of Satan.
Oh, Satan.
Yeah, Satan.
Yes. Okay. So the answer is there is a deep connection to the notion of Satan and evil. Not the least of which is that one part of the legends of Satan is that he dwells or will be cast into the abyss. That what Botting calls that black hole, that deep dark hole. The legend of Satan also says that he'll be resurrected out of the abyss. And so there is a direct parallel there to Stoker and the legend of Satan, because Dracula lives in the essence of the abyss in Transylvania, comes out of his coffin, for example, during the night, and goes to the west, the epitome of light, but then comes back to be destroyed. So there are direct parallels between that age-old legend of Satan, the biblical legend of Satan, and the notion of Satan in other religious texts. That was again a very poor answer, but yes, there is a direct correlation in that sequence of events. And certainly Stoker, as a Protestant, would have been well aware of the hellfire and brimstone that was preached in the Anglican churches in Ireland of the day, and the notion of hell. And certainly there is another element, which I don't have time to go into, the notion of the second death, the eternal death, because that's part of Satan. He's a resurrection to destroy the earth, such as Satan, and his death. There will be a resurrection out of that, such as is the implication in Dracula's death, that he will be resurrected again. That was very quick.
Thank you, yeah. Thank you, sir. And we have a few questions that Ashutosh will read out.
Okay.
And you can respond to that. Ashutosh, over to you.
Okay, sir. Professor, can you hear me?
Sorry, can you speak a bit? It's very...
Hello.
Yes, Ashutosh.
Oh, sir. So I had a question that can Dracula be seen as a representative of the colonizer? Because just like the colonizers depend on the colonized, Dracula lives on the blood of his victims.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was a fear of the time, and certainly an experience of Stoker, that this notion of penetrating, of killing, of demonizing, and certainly in every modern day cinematic version of the colonizer, it is the death of women that precipitates any sort of outcry and change. So as I said, Dracula is polyvalent, many voices, many deaths, and certainly there was a fear of invasion of Europe being colonized by the dark other. It had already happened. It was deeply imbued in the mind of Europeans that there had been an invasion of the Chinese from the east to the west. They'd got to the walls of some of the major European cities and were repelled. And so, yes, Dracula does represent the invader, the ultimate colonizer, yes.
Yes, Professor.
And I would probably argue he represents Britain.
Oh, yeah, that's nice. Okay, so Anirban Banerjee, one of my friends, is asking, although Dracula belongs to a marginalized colonized class, in this case he assumes the central position of a colonizer. Is this subversion of a result of the author as well as the then colonizer's feeling of insecurity, a fear of being pushed to the margins?
And there's one step further to that too. I agree with that whole point. We now know, for example, that colonizers tend to destroy, kill, rape, pillage, and wreck. But from the psychology field, we know through a lot of modern research and also research into how colonizers dealt with their own insecurities, is that every time they raped and pillaged and killed, they were killing part of their soul, the sense of who they were. And so then the more they took over, the more they actually destroyed their own sense of self. And so Dracula certainly epitomizes the colonizer in that sense. And certainly in his own death, epitomize his own ultimate destruction, his own ultimate piercing, his own slitting of the throat. Every colonizer is doomed to fail because they carry with them the narrative stain of an insecurity of creating death. It's as simple as that. We are not created to be colonizers. We're created to do the exact opposite, if that makes any sense.
Yes, sir. So Konika Mondol is asking, what's your recommendation for the best way of killing a vampire? That's a funny one, actually.
Okay. The best way of killing a vampire. All right, so there have been modern translations and transliterations of the vampire. The best way to kill a vampire is the old-fashioned way. Stake through the heart, the crucifix, and garlic.
So Rohit Das is asking, can you speak something about Van Helsing?
About who? Oh, Van Helsing.
Van Helsing. I think you have talked about a bit about Van Helsing.
Yeah, as I said before, Van Helsing, I think, is the epitome of a father figure that Stoker never had. That wise old man, the wise old healer. Van Helsing is also, as I said, the spiritual detective. He is that person who is not afraid to read other ancient texts, to read outside of what was then the Christian purview, outside the accepted Christian canon of what Christians should read. Van Helsing was open-minded. He was a transformer. He was a genuine carer of women. He was the person who was not afraid to break cultural mores to save women. I mean, he spent all night with Lucy to save her. He gave his own blood to save her, whereas Dracula wanted to take the blood and, in fact, at one stage forced Lucy to drink his own blood. Van Helsing was the epitome of the genuine carer, the person who develops deep attachment, and is also a carer of the youth. Van Helsing was the person who was able to transform the young people in that narrative into the sense of who they should be. He was not afraid also to delve into the dark side of humanity in order to understand it. Now, I am not advocating that we read dark texts or practice Satanism, but what I am advocating is that we have to be much more open-minded in our world to understand how others think and how others react and what others do, but also not afraid to also step into the world where othering is going on and fix it. To me, that's the symbolic essence of Van Helsing.
Okay, he is also asking, is Dracula immortal?
Are the undead immortal? Do they live forever? The answer to that is we simply do not know. But what we can recognise is that when monsters are named in literature, they immediately transform into something else and come back later in another different form. That's been the constant through all Dracula literature and all monster literature. So we assume that Dracula is not immortal. He is He is undead. What that actually means is still a big discussion for debate. He is alive but not alive. He is dead but he is not dead. He has the propensity to come back in another form. Allah, in Stoker's book, he crumbles to ash, but he does not disappear. I also think too that the notion of immortality is also represented in how many variants we commonly have of Dracula. There are two, and I'm going to use that word very unwisely. There are two classics, monster classics in our world. It is Shelley's Frankenstein and it is Stoker's Dracula. Both have become repetitious constantly in the forms that they now create, simply because the human condition does not learn its mistakes. We have not grown from the elements that caused the creation of Stoker's vampire through to the modern age. And so, in a narrative sense, monsters will always appear until we understand what our narrative stains are personally and socially and correct it. We are slow learners as a race, and so narratively, monsters will always occur. Is Dracula in its form immortal? Probably. I know that was a bit of a ramble, but probably.
Yeah. Barman is asking, can Dracula be considered as a point of cultural saturation of the late Victorian anti-Christian occultism?
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's also a binary. It epitomizes the othering that was coming over Victorian Christianity, the use of the spirituality. There's no coincidence that ghost stories suddenly arose, that the Gothic arose. And so Dracula epitomizes that. But it's a coincidenta oppistorum. It also has another flip side to that, and should be read as that as well, is that the restrictions of Victorian Christianity were killing the culture, were certainly denigrating to women. And while Dracula represents the dark side, it also represents the need to shift culturally and socially, to change. I hope that answered the question.
Okay. And Anirban Banerjee is asking, can we say that Dracula's being an undead and his being a satanic being comes from the colonizer's gaze, all of the colonized being satanic tribes? And
Absolutely.
Is Dracula's being undead is a result of subverting the idea and hierarchy of the Catholic heaven and hell concept?
I would say yes, 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 and yes. Absolutely. It is that polyvalent, I typically don't want to bash religions, but Dracula is a representation of the whole notion of religion and its form of domination, both as a colonizer and both as a religious entity. Dracula came to show that the theological beliefs of the time were blatantly wrong and were oppressive to society and needed to be changed. Dracula, as the epitome of the other, is the epitome of the religious other. That might be, I don't know, but that's what I personally believe. I wouldn't go around saying that in public, but Certainly, that's what I believe.
Okay, Ashutosh.
Yes, sir.
So I think Konika's question is the last one. So
Yes,
we
sir.
can take that and we can
Call it a
draw.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last question is from Konika Mondol again. How are the novels Beloved and Dracula similar and different in their representation of the supernatural?
Whoa. The Beloved? Is that what is a
Yes,
shift?
Yes, Professor. The name of the novel is Beloved and Dracula.
Okay, so they both contain similarities to the original and they both contain differences. They all growth. The notion of the Beloved, as the word says, Dracula in the Beloved, or the Draculian figure, the vampiric figures, from there on in, from that text and all those kind of texts, show Dracula having an emotional side, the notion of emotions within the narratives start to come to the fore, which shows a shift in thinking in regard to how we see the undead and what it means to be the undead. But it also is dangerous because it's just a shift in cultural perception. It's just a shift in narrative to show that we have to be very careful of what we perceive to be the norm, that a world of the vampire that has love and that looks like us is probably more dangerous in symbolism and in form than anything else in the past. We have to be very careful of wolves in sheep clothing, culturally speaking. I think that's what it's actually saying.
Okay. So all the questions are answered, I guess. So Debayan sir, please go on.
Thank you so much, sir, for your precious time and for delving so deep into the text of Dracula and also the intertexts. Actually, you have spoken about the linguistic possibilities, the literary possibilities, the narrative intertextuality between linguistic and literary, and the psychoanalysis point of view, the cognitive science, especially of how childhood develops, even talking about the background of Bram Stoker's his own personal life, how disability, the lack of the father, the influence of the mother, all these things have enlightened and enriched us so much in so many ways actually, and taking us much deeper and much beyond than the sensationalism of the text itself. Mm-hmm. So in that way we are very much enriched by your valuable talk today, and so honored to have with us you and your precious time with us. And since you are into spirituality studies also and many other interesting fields I have seen from your bio note, so we hope to have you and your precious self with us later on also in future collaborations with you. And thank you so much for being with us and guiding us through a dark text and interesting text like Dracula. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Debayan, and thank you everyone for their time. I really appreciate it. It was my pleasure. I hope to talk to you or see you again.
Yeah, sir, one more thing. Do you have a handout of your lecture or something that maybe you can mail us for our further reference or something? Then it would help actually.
I can put something down. I typically don't write notes, but I can put something down and send something to you at least anyway.
Okay. That would be a very great help for us, all of us.
Not a problem.
Okay. Thank you so much. Stay safe, stay healthy, and may the pandemic situation goes away more sooner than later.
And my response is the same. I hope you are all well and hope it goes away for all of you very soon.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, sir. Bye, sir. Thank you so much.